The need by all human beings to know how to live is perennial. One of the most self-evident duties of a teacher is to help the student answer the question, what is a good life? Philosophers have argued for thousands of years over what constitutes a just cause. In fact, a cause so just it is worth fighting and dying for. The right of self-determination is a right that hundreds of millions, and more likely billions of people have fought and died for throughout human history. And yet, thanks in part to the influence on public policies to this very day by Machiavelli, most human beings in the 21st century are not in possession of the right of self-determination. Now, part 10 is entitled The Great Transition. The Great Transition involves understanding basic freedom. We will rely heavily on concepts taught by the late, great Dallas Willard, who was a professor at the University of Southern California in this segment. The Great Transition refers to a process of maturity that self-actualized adults all experience. It begins with recognizing we can exercise our right to choose our own teacher. Who will our teacher be? So with this in mind, let's take a closer look at the teacher we discussed at the end of part 4 in this series. After going over all the evidence, including both the testimonies and subsequent actions of the witnesses from 2,000 years ago, especially the remarkable behaviors of the 12 disciples after the resurrection, the assertion was made that as impossible as all of this might seem, Jesus was who he says he was. It is the logical thing to think about at this stage of the investigation of teachers, to consider what Jesus taught and what he did. The most noteworthy aspect of the teaching method of Jesus was that he was not shy about the level of his authority. In fact, he spoke with so much authority, he offended the theological bureaucrats in Judea, as well as the ruling Roman bureaucrats occupying the area at that time. Jesus offended them because they thought their institutions were the ultimate authority. This reality requires a specific approach to analyzing Jesus, the teacher. If Jesus was not who he says he was simply asserting false claims of authority in some sort of vain attempt to bolster the veracity of his assertions, as most ambitious types often do, he should not be considered a great teacher. Great teachers do not make false claims to enhance their authority. So either Jesus was who he says he was, or he was some sort of self-aggrandizing speech maker seeking to grab power, wealth, and social status. Now, since neither Jesus nor his followers ever exhibited any indications we have identified as being those people seeking the acquisition of power, wealth, and social status we have a conundrum. How in the world did the teachings of Jesus become one of the most powerful forces in human history without him arming himself, deceiving others, injuring others, engaging in warfare, preaching that fear is more useful than love, and eventually justifying the abandonment of his own mission for the expediency necessary to retain power? We are reminded that Machiavelli made this observation regarding what Jesus accomplished in terms of influence. Quote, "There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." Machiavelli added this observation of the process. Quote, "Men rise from one ambition to another. First, they seek to secure themselves against attack, and then they attack others." Now, Jesus never secured himself from attack, let alone did he attack others. point of emphasis stands out in the teaching of Jesus beyond his repeated use of parables. He rejected the obsession with legalism on the part of ruling bureaucracies as being ineffective on the heart. So while bureaucrats are always interested in creating one more rule or law to enforce, Jesus was much more interested in the inner person versus the appearances of legalism that come with passing one more law. His concern was what was going on in the heart, not what ruling bureaucrats were doing for the sake of appearances. Again, this emphasis is in direct contradiction to what Machiavelli taught. Machiavelli often chided the idea of attempting to self-govern through inner goodness. Let's shift gears and consider the topic of wealth. Wealth is an earthly treasure because you can't take it with you. We all leave our wealth behind when we die. We should consider the child whose earthly treasure is the stuffed toy she loves as we think about our own earthly treasures. You know what her treasure is when it is misplaced at bedtime. Now consider the poor homeless person who is down on his or her luck and suffering from depression or despair. All earthly treasures are contained in a soiled backpack and the rickety shopping cart that is pushed from place to place. It is best not to try to take away these treasures from this person, nor is it even logical to be puzzled at why trying to take these treasures away is likely to produce a violent reaction. These earthly treasures are all the prized possession of this human being. Earthly treasures are not restricted to money or even the tangible things we often refer to as our stuff. Earthly treasures can also be intangibles like our reputation or honors bestowed on us by others. Trophies, medals, all fits in the same category. Even intangible earthly treasures take on the properties of everything else that is subject to the second law of thermodynamics, which is that over time, most physical substances are perishable. And even if they last a long time, human bodies are extremely perishable. So it would seem that our reputations, that being what others think of us, are also perishable. The list of examples is practically endless. Other prized possessions can be social status that comes with driving a high-end late model luxury automobile or living in a very impressive home. Now, Jesus taught his immediate followers and the thousands who eventually began to attend his gatherings that laying up earthly treasures produces a false sense of security. As an individual who worked with wealthy people for nearly 40 years, I can honestly say there is no correlation whatsoever between wealth and true peace, joy, or contentment. Of course, Machiavelli would disagree on these points. So with all of this in mind, let's engage in a few additional comparisons between the teachings of Machiavelli and Jesus. On the idea of judging others, Jesus taught us we should judge others the way we would prefer to be judged. He also taught that all final judgments were to be left to his Father. Machiavelli taught that one of the great things about possessing power was the fact that it can come with the power to judge others and even kill them if it was deemed necessary. When it comes to the use of discernment, which is different from judgment, Jesus taught the skill of discernment was for the purpose of avoiding actions that are wrong instead of right. Machiavelli taught that all efforts directed towards discernment should be with the purpose of acquiring and retaining power. Now, the late, great Charlie Munger was my investment teacher. Munger taught his students over many years about the wonderful utility of the principle of inverting. By this, he meant if you don't know what you should invest in, figure out what you should not invest in. Now, Munger credited 19th century mathematician Carl Jacobi for suggesting inverting to solve different math problems was effective. Jesus seems to be the original teacher of the use of inverting. And sometimes this led to inverted conclusions versus conventional thinking, even 2,000 years ago. In his Father's eyes, Jesus taught us those who are the least among us are actually the most among us, and vice versa. Now, Machiavelli taught the more conventional view, which is those who are the most among us are the most among us. Jesus taught to whom much is given, much is expected. Machiavelli taught to whom much is given, the least is expected, because the most take and the least give. In their teachings, the member institutions of the NCAA we examined in part 9 of this series sometimes communicate other priorities beyond the profitability of their sports entertainment businesses. Higher education has been very interested in recent decades in promoting the concept of inclusion. There are certainly many social benefits that come with this virtue of the heart, that is, when it's present. And the principle of inclusion seems important enough to be a point of emphasis in higher education, a big point of emphasis. In fact, the virtues of inclusion have been taught so exhaustively in higher education in recent years, it has become literally a buzzword that permeates society. We won't list all the benefits that would surface if every human being embraced in their heart the fundamental principle of inclusion. There are too many benefits to list. Machiavelli, on the other hand, tended to condescend when commenting on the need for inclusion at every stage of life. Here's an example. He said, quote, "The distinction between children and adults, while probably useful for some purposes, is at bottom a specious one, I feel. There are only individual egos crazy for love," end of quote. Now, any examination of the teachings of Jesus makes it obvious he is easily the most famous and persistent teacher of the virtues of inclusion in human history. According to all testimonies, Jesus was chastised repeatedly for involving everyone in his teachings, including those described by the ruling bureaucracies of his time as lepers and the unclean, as well as people with other diseases, including mental illnesses and many other maladies. Jesus embraced those who were downtrodden and isolated from the rest of society. And on many occasions, the New Testament records incidences when the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Sanhedrin, and the occupying forces of Rome became openly upset with the insistence by Jesus of inclusion. An exchange between a legal expert and Jesus recorded in the Gospels is worth repeating. Quote, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Now, a little background is necessary to illustrate inclusion as this conversation with Jesus continued. The followers of Jesus considered the Samaritans their bitter enemies. So let's get back to the conversation. "And who is my neighbor?" asked the man who engaged Jesus on the question of what was the most important commandment. In his second reply, Jesus used a parable, which was his favorite teaching method. I'll read it. "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going by the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan," oh, those enemies, "when the Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, currency in those days, and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Then Jesus asked of his questioner, quote, Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Of course, the expert in the law replied, the man who had mercy on him. With utter authority, Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Why? It's inclusion. Love your neighbor as yourself, including your perceived enemies. This is the essence of inclusion, and Jesus was going against the grain of the law to get people's hearts and get to people's hearts in his efforts to spread a message of inclusion. And of course, this parable specifically mentioned the unpopular Samaritans, who were widely perceived as enemies by most of those around him. Now, the perception by higher education regarding the fundamental values of successfully teaching inclusion does not identify the embracing of inclusion as a condition of the heart. Instead, it is insisted on at most institutions of higher learning that laws must be created to produce inclusion. This creates a dubious notion that there is a statistical definition of inclusion. And with this flawed approach, an emphasis on legalistic policies is futile in its attempt to change the readings of mere statistics. Not coincidentally, this approach places the power to define, interpret, and enforce the virtues of inclusion in the hands of bureaucracies. Now, whatever one's view might be on the best way to foster an attitude of inclusion, it is curious that in rifling through the mountains of higher education journals, there is no mention of the revolutionary interest Jesus took in inclusion 2,000 years ago, let alone the risks he took in efforts to build embracement of inclusion in the hearts of his students. It's as if history has been rewritten in recent years to convey the idea that the virtues of inclusion were only recently discovered by faculty members and administrators at educational institutions of higher learning. Like so many other topics we have already covered in this segment, reactions to the questions on the efficacy of prayer produces tremendous contrast from teacher to teacher. Jesus taught his small band of followers that prayer was a method that could be used to communicate with the Spirit manifest in the laws of the universe that is superior to that of man. In most institutions of higher learning, the mere mention of the act of prayer is most often treated as a surefire sign that the person praying is engulfed in a confused tangle of quirky superstitions. The father of scientific rigor and modern analytical methods was Sir Isaac Newton. He had this to say about communicating with the Spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. Quote, all my discoveries have been made in answer to prayer. So Newton did not merely engage in prayer, he credited all his amazing discoveries to answered prayers. Now, no doubt this would have made Machiavelli's skin crawl if he had lived during the Newtonian 17th century instead of the one that preceded it. In support of the efficacy of prayer, there have been a number of serious studies done in recent decades. One of the most remarkable studies on prayer that was ever conducted was, like the statements of Einstein and Newton, buried away from discussion by educational institutions of higher learning. The most remarkable project was conducted by cardiologist Dr. Randolph Bird. The results were published in the Southern Medical Journal in 1988. Bird's methods in the study were rigorous. It was a prospective, randomized, double-blind, and controlled study. These are the highest standards possible in terms of rigor for scientific research efforts. Dr. Bird enrolled 400 subjects and found positive effects from distant intercessory prayer. In the study, both Protestant and Catholic Christians were given the patient's first name, condition, and diagnosis. They were instructed to pray for a rapid recovery and for prevention of complications and death. Bird found that patients in the prayer group had less congestive heart failure, fewer cardiac arrests, fewer episodes of pneumonia, and were also less often either intubated or ventilated. They also required less diuretic and antibiotic therapies. The responses to these findings from higher education was simple. Critics of the study emerged quickly and found that because, quote, the spirit that both Newton and Einstein found manifest in the laws of the universe was actually part of the experiment, and this spirit could not be completely controlled like all other control groups, the study by rule was invalid. And herein lies the irreconcilable difference between most institutions of higher learning and the much more nuanced scientific approaches of Einstein and Newton. By rule, higher education will invalidate any scientific study where this spirit, identified by both Einstein and Newton, is one of the variables, simply because this spirit cannot be controlled. So the efficacy of prayer, even in a rigorous study that controls all other variables, is automatically deemed to be invalid by higher education. This philosophical restriction certainly has curbed both the funding and the appetite for any further studies in the area of the efficacy of prayer, despite what Newton said. In the meantime, higher education has its own problems, illustrating with its actions the commitment to inclusion. Nothing illustrates this problem more effectively than recent circumstances surrounding disgraced former Harvard University president Claudine Gay. Now, regrettably, Gay was incapable of characterizing calls for genocide of Jewish people on the Harvard campus as wrong after protesters were permitted to do so with impunity. It was a sobering look at the mindset at the very top of the ruling bureaucratic hierarchy at the highest profile school of higher learning in the world when confronted on her astounding decision to refuse to take a position on the rights and wrongs of permitting protesters to incite acts of genocide. Gay managed during her ineffective efforts at damage control a day later to say, quote, "I am sorry, words matter." Now, once it became obvious that the now former Harvard president, Claudine Gay, could not sort out the basics of right and wrong, she offered this excuse, quote, "I got caught up in what had become at that point an extended combative exchange about policies and procedures. Substantively, I failed to convey what was my truth." Now, in this statement, it was revealing of a guiding principle permeating higher education. Quote, "my truth," end of quote, is a term that completely demeans the value of the term truth. Truth is not something that belongs to one person. Truth cannot be modified by a personal pronoun like my car or my house. And herein lies the problem with what former Harvard President Derek Bach identified within the mindsets of educational institutions of higher learning that had led to widespread academic fraud, has led to widespread academic fraud and unfair labor practices in higher education, sports, entertainment businesses. If each person is afforded their own truth, then a personalized truth becomes merely a justification for any questionable actions taken, not actual truth. What logically follows is the definition of the meaning of truth. It becomes a Machiavellian tool, indistinguishable from other malleable opinions associated with everyday life. That both Harvard's and Stanford's presidents resigned in disgrace in less than a year fits the larger picture we have been describing in this entire series. Ostensibly, former Harvard President Claudine Gay was not fired by Harvard due to the incident we have discussed. She was forced to resign for her actions, not her words. The ethical breach that resulted in Gay's departure from the top of Harvard's policy-making pyramid was her commission of plagiarism in an academic paper she claimed to be the author of. Apparently, Claudine Gay found a way to justify no inclusion of the credit for a person whose work she took credit for. No inclusion. All is abundantly clear that the cancer of mission abandonment has metastasized for higher education. This is not unique in history. Even after the stranglehold on power over education held by the Roman Catholic Church was splintered and dispersed among monarchies opposed to the Vatican, an incredible series of bloody wars ensued. The leaders of both Catholic and Protestant institutions presided over these wars that dispersed power. It was all about power. And during the wars, and in many other instances, the primary mission of the most important teachings of Jesus were treated as if they were rubbish. In their words, both Protestant and Catholic monarchs asserted they loved the Lord their God with all their hearts, all their souls, all their strength, and all their minds, and they loved their neighbors as themselves. In their deeds, they did not. In the name of their truths, many European monarchs, both Catholic and Protestant, engaged in policies that resulted in the slaughter of millions of their neighbors. We entitled this segment The Great Transition because it represents the most essential element of self-determination. This being the freedom to choose your own teacher. And given these findings, the task of choosing our own teacher seems crystal clear. However, simply saying we choose Jesus as our teacher and implementing what Jesus taught us to do is clearly a case of easier said than done. In the final segment of this series, we will do our best to wrap things up by addressing what we can do about these difficulties that are seemingly inevitable as we continue to search for the answer to the great question.
Thank you for watching. We need your help to spread the word about answering the great question. Please don't forget to like this segment and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Also, we hope you will tell your friends, family, and coworkers about answering the great question.